see a little bit of what I have going on here. I'm going to take it to the beginning and just give you a little background if I could. And if you guys are having a hard time hearing me or something's not working technically, just please chime in. I think all of us have been through all the virtual aspects and anomalies over the past year of things that don't seem to roll very good sometimes. But I appreciate the opportunity. Again, my name is Paul Ridlin. I'm the chief over the surface water hydraulics and modeling group, H&H group there, and also fluvial mechanics and geomorphology group. Unfortunately, Dr. Jessica Leroy could not be here this evening, but she was also going to accompany me. She's has a lot of good insight and experience with working on a lot of issues that the City of Wildwood's been working on with the task force group here. And I'm again coming to this certainly green because I've not been involved since the beginning with a lot of these discussions. So I've drank from the fire hose a little bit to see some of the information that has been shared with Dr. David Hammer and other folks and consultants that have done a lot of work and assessment there, taking a look at Cox Creek and other Hamilton and Bonham and Wildwood, Wild Horse Creek and some of the areas over there. So I'm not going into the detail of that. I think we just want to try to give you a little bit of background on what our agency does and some of the support and capabilities aspect of that. And then probably touch a little bit on, the funding aspect, which I think at the end of the day, that's really kind of an important piece as well. So the Central Midwest Water Science Center of the USGS, just for a little bit of background, that is a 3-state center, Missouri, Iowa, and Illinois. And Dan is correct. I'm still on the Merrimack Recreational Association group there. We've done a lot of work in the Merrimack Basin, and we work with a lot of different agencies, probably just like you all, but we're just really in a lot of different collaborative groups all the time and trying to leverage a lot of existing science that's out there to make it cost effective, right? Finding those data sets and sources of information that we can put together and try to deliver a good piece of science or a monitoring program or a planning aspect that we do in a cost effective way, yet, that has some viability to it. So if you can see the slide, I kind of dive right into, and I don't want to get paralyzed too much with this, but we study and we work with all kinds of different entities from start to finish, from the data collection side all the way to more complex modeling and everything in between. The thing that we don't get involved with, and I've shared this with Dan before, and I see Rick's on too, I've talked to Rick in the past, we don't get involved with the design aspect. That's generally up to the consultants and so forth to get involved with certain things with bank stability and bioengineered type of designs that are there to be able to mitigate some of the issues. But what we see in the lower right is kind of going to a really interesting model. I'm just going to kind of break in with that. I'm not going to go into detail, but it's what we call RVR meander. Just give you right to the end game here. It's a 2-dimensional river meander mitigation model or migration model, excuse me. Such a model as this, and trying to avoid some of the technical speak, really deals with a few fluvial erosion rates. And we take a look at what happens over time with these erosion rates as modeled essentially proportional to the difference between the shear stress acting on the bank and a critical shear stress needed to erode the bank, of course. And it deals with a lot of other things than that. It's most simplistic form. It deals with cantilever features of the bank using an undercut threshold and some planar feature failures using a factor of safety and all this other mumbo jumbo, right? But we do a lot of interesting work with the modeling side and addressing fluvial erosion. But to be able to do that, we get into the data side first. And I know as I've taken a look at a lot of the documents, not all of them, just kind of peruse those, that there has been a considerable amount of assessment that's been done there, some really detailed assessment to some extent. There's been some good outreach that I've seen with the scouts that Dr. Hammer, I believe, has done, and some other folks. So I really applaud the efforts that have been there so far. So the next thing I'd like to show is just kind of when we talk about the data collection, we can talk about it, from the stream gauge. And I think that's the first thing that Dan, kind of shared with me. He says, Paul, what do you think about a stream gauge in the area? And I said, well, that may not be, the best choice, but it may be. It just depends upon what kind of data we're looking at. And we really have to kind of dig in to find out what's been done and where we're headed with this to know, how do you optimize, a stream gauge such as this. In other words, gathering hydrology and being able to get the stage and discharge is very, very good information, of course, to be able to put into models and certain aspects to solve some of the problems here. But sediment may be even more important when we start looking at sediment supply and transport capacity of the channel and things of that nature. So it just depends. We have 10,000 gauges throughout the country, 280 in the state of Missouri, and certainly we focus a lot of these on stormwater best management practices. A lot of communities, they're put in to take a look at how effective these BMPs are, whether it's a silt fence and things and just basic development, or if we're taking a look at channel widening and incision and you're taking a look at sediment supply, there's a sediment, portion there that is very, very important to understand. And in doing so, we got to have the data. So if I can just say this, it's just, any of this fancy stuff that we do in terms of interpretive work and modeling, we cannot do and won't do without good data to be able to calibrate and validate these models and these predictions and things that we look at. That's a fundamental thing to our agency. Some folks think we're a little bit too anal retentive about it and we dot the I's and cross the T's too much. But I'll never feel bad about that. We go out and collect a ton of data. And that data can range from anything. You can take a look at the mapping side, which I know has been done to a degree there. I don't know all the details. Taking a look at such things as even damage, not only to obviously, the erosion that we see on banks, but even infrastructure damage, culverts, head cuts, and then maybe taking a look at patterns. What do we see in bank patterns for flow lines or using aerial photos, LiDAR, land cover, soils, things of that nature. These are things we target. Bank stability and mass wasting, for instance, a lot of conceptual things that I know you have been, had a lot of presentations that have been shared with me that covered most everything there. So the data collection is a big piece. What we have to think about is, from my basic understanding of what's existed to this point, is to understand that there has been priority locations that have been defined, probably will be discussed more in this meeting, and a path forward. And so we have to find out how our agency could potentially fit into that. And one of the things that comes up is really kind of a monitoring piece maybe of this. And so we're going to just talk a little bit about that and see if any of those things have any relevance, and then we'll talk about a few other things. One thing that I shared with Dan early on is what we call the Usgs Fluvial Erosion Hazards Primer. You can look at it as a glorified piece of outreach, but it's actually a really, really good storybook. And I'm not just saying that because I work for the Usgs. This is a really good product. Hopefully you've had a chance to take a look at it. And if you don't want to memorize the HTTPS URL there, just Google Usgs Fluvial Erosion Hazards Primer. I'm sure it'll get you there. We got a lot of different tabs there that really go through the introductory aspects of this primer and dealing with fluvial erosion, the geomorphology basics, things that are more on a regional scale down to the reach scale when we start looking at this information. So it's outreach in a way, but not necessarily maybe to the general public, because it gets into a lot of good detail there that I think most folks would find interesting, and it kind of conveys in a real nice summary what the capabilities are of our agency to be able to share and provide. So I want to encourage the task force here maybe to take a look at that and see what interest there may be. The stream gauging is certainly just one tab, but there's so many different tabs on this. Reach hydrodynamics, for instance, our agency is very, we've got a strong team that deal with hydraulic modeling and hydrology, right? Both watershed and hydraulics. But we rarely deal with one-dimensional models. We deal with a lot of 2D and 3D models in a lot of these different areas, depending upon the complexity and what we're trying to study. If it's sediment transport, and we're looking at for sort of responses and so forth. We often 2D or 3D models is the choice that we use there. And I'm sorry I'm getting into some technical weeds here with this stuff, but there are some interesting things that come from this. Again, everything from the geomorphology basics, and I've seen several presentations, or at least one or two, that kind of cover some of this without getting in the weeds. I don't think that's the intent here of some of that. And then even dealing with some conceptual things as far as equilibrium of the channel, when we start looking at sediment size and stream slope, for instance, and these terms we call degradation and aggradation of these channel beds. You know, it's all part of the geomorphology speak to understand how these things behave. We discuss channel widening and channel incision, whether we're looking at supply, sediment supply, right, that matches its transport ability. So a lot of these buzzwords, you know, come up through this particular primer, and again reflects our capabilities. Another slide here is taking a look at the field methods, and by the pictures that I've seen, there's been obviously a lot of field work. And the field work can range from a site visit that's an hour and a half to your hour to 2 hours, or it can be something that's there, you know, half a day or more. It just depends upon the detail that we're trying to capture. And I think I'd like to share a little bit more of that detail, because I know much of it has been done in that regard. So I'm not sure where the group is here on a lot of the LiDAR data. And I'm sure you have folks that are looking at this obviously pretty close, but our LiDAR data right now for St. Louis County, at least on the western side of that, is what we call QL3 data. So it's 20 centimeters in what we call the vertical. In other words, how well are we going to be in the Z direction up and down? And that sounds pretty good to a lot of us, but we'd sure like to get more detail out of that. And so this year, it's planned, and whether or not it makes it out to the western part of the county, we're looking at a fall acquisition with NRCS in 2021 to be able to capture QL2 data, which is going to get us down below 0.3 foot. And, you know, it's going to provide a lot more what we call high resolution topography and information that's going to be helpful, you know, for any work moving forward, whether or not it's design or doing some construction or whatever that might be, that data is going to be useful. So that's a good thing, because that information doesn't really cost us anything. But the details also that we need to think about, and maybe have already been thought about, is really terrestrial LiDAR and using that capability to be able to monitor. And we do a lot of this. This may or may not have a fit here, but to give you an example, we see areas out there that are impounded, you know, big lakes and so forth, that are under the regulatory constraint of the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission. And when they are, they have to be compliant with a suite of things, one of which is to ensure that your releases that are coming out of these big reservoirs are not going to impact the downstream channel banks. And so this is a good example of what we see in the little black image below, you know, over the course of a couple of years, and being able to monitor these banks and take a look at that kind of detail. We can't get that out of area-based LiDAR. It just doesn't work in its physics because it's more planimetric, you know. So there's something that we've continued to do with LiDAR to be able to assess and monitor a lot of these erosion type occurrences throughout the country. And we have a lot of capability just within Missouri and a lot of instrumentation to be able to get out and do this. The other aspect of that is, of course, drones. And maybe you already have contracted drones and done some work here, I don't know. We have that capability, and we have contractors also that we work through as well. And so with the drone imagery, when we're starting to deal with, you know, these different channels like Hawks Creek, for instance, we're getting obviously a higher degree of resolution there, not only from the imagery, but then depending upon the air vehicle, we can mount what we call a LiDAR puck in there, and then also grab the high resolution topography data. Even more so than this stuff I was talking about that's 0.3 foot or less, you know. So there's some really good capabilities there to help take a look and map and collect data in these areas. One other quick thing that I'll touch on, and again, I won't spend too much detail. This is what we call structure from motion It's also kind of like a stereo pair. You know, back in the day, we take two images and you find feature matched in multiple photographs. It's the same type of concept, but the technology is advanced. So there's been some areas on the Merrimack, for instance, where we've used some stereo pairs, and we've gone back, 50 years or so, even more, and been able to, resurrect, topography throughout the floodplains and do some interesting work there as we're looking at the effects of cumulative development and things of that nature. So a lot of good sources, I think, to be able to provide some additional field assessment and more on the monitoring side, not only with the data collection and maybe targeting data collection to more sediment, because sediment supply is a big issue when we deal with channel widening and incision and so forth, maybe understand the source of that, but also just the geometry in and of itself. And just to kind of wrap up here, in its most basic sense, because I mean, I could have, 80 slides here. I certainly don't want to do that. But erosion monitoring, we want to know what we get from that. And, essentially, whether it's erosion or deposition and these rates there, they vary in space and time. So if we're looking at, annual reach retreat, in this particular example, these are very good pieces of information to be able to put forth in a plan, to be able to monitor the effectiveness of these practices or whatever type of implementations that occur along the channel reach here in Cox Creek or wherever it might be. They do vary in space and time, but again, it's how effective the mitigation has been, and sediment yields are one of those, as I talked about that earlier. So that's one piece of it as well, because ultimately that goes into taking a look for if we ever do anything that gets to the point of modeling and looking at a predictive case into the future, but it certainly just addresses some of the stability overall. So that's kind of the short dime tour, if you will, of some of the technical things without going into a lot of details on hydraulics and hydrology, time and concentration, and urbanization, and some of these other things of that our office essentially provides. But there's certainly a lot more. I do want to touch on a couple things, and I've chatted with Dan on this before, is that our agency does enter into different types of collaborative partnerships where we are able to go ahead and contribute appropriations and dollars to different types of work, depending upon what that work may be and what that effort may be. And generally, those are tied a little bit more to the interpretive side and doing the interpretive investigations, if you will, versus the data collection side. But yet they are some somewhat significant appropriations and costs that we can offset by getting involved and having some place that the USGS is able to provide support. Albeit it has to be cost effective and has to be optimal with our backgrounds and experience to be able to do that. So I just wanted to make mention of that. And I think that's pretty much covers most of it. So appreciate you all letting me have a few words here. And I can try to answer some questions, but if they're going to be super technical, then I'm going to have to phone Dr. Jess Leroy there. She couldn't make it tonight to answer some of the more detailed things. She's got a whole team of geomorphologists and engineers, that really studies this stuff. So it's.
Thank you, Mr. Rudland. Any questions? Mr. Gunther.
Thank you very much. That was a fascinating overview. One of the things we've talked about as a group is the use of LIDAR and better understanding the detention basins that we have upstream and if they're performing or not, and the impact downstream. And I wonder if you could maybe say a few words about the potential of us better understanding our overall system, and in particular also the health of these detention and retention basins relative to the problems we're facing.
Sure. I think first and foremost, we look at the system, based on hydrology. And so I'll even start a step back from that. Maybe this is already looked at. We don't have any real good long-term stations in there. I was talking to my National Weather Service colleague about where the nearest station was to go back and take a look at the frequency, intensity, and duration of some of the storm events and rain events that we've had in the area. And over time, I think that's an interesting piece of information, because what we want to try to do is call out just the system in and of itself atmospherically, right? What have we seen come in terms of the frequency of these rainfall events? And then they lend themselves into a good watershed model, where when we get into a nice watershed model like that, then we start to evaluate the effectiveness of some of the retention or detention areas that you've got, in the watershed. And I don't know the details of what that might be, but certainly water is the big driver, of course, in all of this. And so when we start to temper the peaks and the runoff that's occurring by some of these detention retention areas, then that's obviously a big aspect and a big, it's a positive and a benefit to the system overall that starts to lend itself to, increased shear stress and velocity in the main channel, where you're getting a greater amount of water that's obviously finding its way down there. So that's very, I don't want to say it's just you do it, it's super easy, but it's certainly something that we do. We put it into a watershed model, evaluate what's there. We can take a look at increasing or relocating different areas of retention or detention. And the other hot button topic, and again, this is more for a really highly urbanized area, obviously, is green infrastructure and really focusing on permeable pavement and riparian buffers and different things of that nature. So that's not an uncommon thing that we also plug in as well, to see how it's mitigating flood volumes and obviously associated velocities and shear stress that comes with that. So I don't know if a lot of that was Greek or not, but we do a lot of that with the modeling aspect, and it's not uncommon. We've got several projects, 3 of them right now, that we're working on very similar efforts there.
Thank you.
Mr. Vunich.
Mr. Ridlin, thank you again for being here tonight. My question relates to the last item on your presentation, funding. If the city wanted to access that funding, is there an application process? And if there is, how do you access that application process?
Well, there really isn't an application so much. The funding comes with a bit of it's more of a cost share that we get into. So if there is something that the USGS is involved with that you would find to be useful and integrate in with everything else that that the city's been involved with, then at that point we would enter into an agreement that would go ahead and have that cost share as part of that. The percentage of that cost share is something that's a little variable, depends upon certain parameters and the work that we do, and also what we have available to us. I always tell people it's like this great big piggy bank that we all kind of compete for. And so, but those would be dollars that we would enter into an agreement with the city and say, okay, the GS could be involved in this type of thing. So we would offset a lot of the costs in that manner. And how those appropriations would be applied, if that makes sense.
Mr. Chair, if I could do a follow-up, please.
Sure.
So it sounds like the USGS looks at projects or problems and sees if there's a benefit for their participation. What are the triggers that would be needed for the city of Wildwood to gain that interest of USGS?
Well, I think some of the things that I've kind of shown here, we would have to kind of sit back, look through, and kind of filter through some of the work that's been done, have a little guidance from yourself or Dan or Rick or whoever, Dr. Hammer, some of the folks have been involved, and try to find some fit. But we threw out a couple ideas in terms of, the monitoring piece of that. That certainly is applicable. If we get into modeling, that's probably even more applicable. To be able to cost share those dollars, like the example I was sharing earlier on the hydrology side, taking a look at flows, and also maybe the what we're seeing in terms of precipitation. Another thing that may or may not be of interest to the community is that our agency is really dialing in on a lot of global climate models and looking at climate hydrology. And this has been a big push for some time, but it's not a long time back. It's been more of a recent push that we're taking a look and trying to offer some prediction into the future, kind of like what FEMA does in some of their flood insurance studies when they're looking at 1% base future flood, for instance. It's a little bit more involved in that, but it takes a look at future floods that we would expect maybe 10, 20, 30 years out, and applying that also to these watershed models, right? That would lend themselves to some of the dynamics that we're seeing in the channel. So the modeling is one piece. Some of the monitoring that we talked about, that could be another piece. Those are all triggers that are fair game to have us involved and potentially work with you all.
Thank you, sir.
Anyone else? No. Thank you again, Mr. Ridlin. You're welcome to stay on and listen to the rest of it, or you can leave.
Okay. I may hang around a little bit. I appreciate it. Thank you very much.
Thank you
Mr.
again.
Chair, Mr. Chair, since no one asked a question, I have one more for Mr. Ridlin, please.
Sure.
Would a letter from the co-chairs of this task force to you asking for that participation be sufficient to maybe get the USGS thinking along those lines?
I don't even think it takes a letter so much. I think it's just a matter of trying to draw up a scope of the USGS involvement, and you know, whatever that scope looks like, it's running it by the board or running it by the city and finding out how we can be of help. And then once that's in there, then I think that's I just bring it back and we go ahead and make it work from there. So I don't think it's any more complicated or doesn't need any bolstering beyond just assuring that, you know, we could be involved some way, somehow with this effort to be able to do that. And when I mean that, it's, you know, the monitoring, the modeling, you know, some potential data collection here and there, you know, something along those lines. I don't know if that makes sense, but it would probably be just trying to get a scope of work or something to find a fit for us. And I'm happy to talk that over with anybody.
Okay. Thank you again. And Mr. Chair, thanks for my interruption.
Yeah, that's okay. Just one question. I did come up with something. So it's basically database stuff you're going to supply, but would you sit down with the city and decide what type of data we need? I mean, we have an idea, but not know what your capability of. Dr. Hammer, go ahead. You're on mute.
Go ahead and finish, Rick.
No, that was it. I just want to know,
Okay.
If there's some cohesion between the city and USGS to come up with a plan.
I was going to ask a question for Dr. Ridlin about the frequency of availability of the LiDAR data. One of the things that would be really helpful for us here in Wildwood would be to look at the rate of change of some of the huge gravel deposits that are collecting in unsatisfactory places in the creek, and get an idea of how fast that material moves as a consequence of any remediation we might do. But we need LiDAR data at least annually for that, and probably 6 months would be better.
Yeah.
Is that possible?
Yeah, it depends upon, you know, there's a couple different ways we can do that. One of the ways I had a quick picture up there showing some terrestrial LiDAR scanners that we've got. We've got a whole suite of those. Some reach out, you know, 1,500 meters. Some of them are pretty quick, and they're a little shorter distance, 300 feet, and these can be moved anywhere. They can be moved such that you set it up traditionally on a tripod, and we just walk up and down, you know, Cox Creek or some of the areas of concern. Or we have them mounted to, believe it or not, some other vehicles, such like a UTV that can, you know, navigate a little bit better maybe in some of these areas. And on bigger rivers, obviously not for Cox Creek, you know, we have them mounted on boats, of course. So the frequency is as often as we feel like we want to do it. Annually would certainly be no issue. And the data that we're getting, just so we're clear on that, it's a lot more finer detail and resolution than anything we're going to get aerial based. So when we're taking a look at some of these smaller changes, that's exactly what we'll see is some fairly small changes. And we tease out the air with this just the same as they do aerial based and some of the algorithms and software. We use this just to give you an example. We monitor dams for the Corps of Engineers, a lot of structures, for any kind of movement. So we're using this, you know, technology that's down there plus or minus a few millimeters or a couple millimeters to be able to do that. So we can increase the frequency as we see fit there. And in terms of a scope, that could be something easy to navigate through with one of you all to find that fit and do that. And I'm happy to get together again with anybody to talk further.
Thank you.
Mr. Gunter.
I have a follow-up on that scope question. The idea of the LiDAR, is that something that we can employ, I'll call it citywide, so we understand the health and the functioning of all of our streams and all of our detention basins within our city boundaries? Again, in the past, we've talked about this is a citywide initiative. All of our citizens are going to be voting on this, and it seems like the best approach would be for us to take a snapshot of the health of our streams citywide, and it might even help us to prioritize what are the most critical areas going forward.
Yeah, no, that's a great question. I think we have to think about LiDAR a couple different ways. When we're talking about the very high resolution type instrumentation that you may have saw on that slide that was sitting up on a tripod, the advantage of that, of course, is it's getting a vertical face, right? So we're not getting anything aerial based with that. So when we're taking a look at some of the details that Dr. Hammer's talking about, or just the channel banks and so forth, that's going to be ideal to be able to capture that. The aerial-based LiDAR, if we're going to try to capture a larger area, then certainly the aerial-based may be the way to go there. Otherwise, it may be, a little lengthy to be able to, take that tripod-mounted LiDAR, for instance, even though we can mount it on UTVs and things of that nature, and try to capture a very significant amount of channel area or length, shall I say. It's not impossible. We've done it certainly before. We probably want to switch over to more drone use at that point to see what we can do to get drones in there, fly a little lower, get that flying height down, and be able to capture some of that information with drones. So we can look at it a little larger to get all of the different, tributaries and open channel system throughout the area. We can capture all of that, but we may take that in terms of its uncertainty, in terms of its resolution, it may increase a little bit, or excuse me, it may decrease because we're just trying to capture a wider footprint, but still possible. And if any of that made sense, I think ultimately we can do it. It's just probably going to be two different approaches.
Thank you.
Dr. Rambo.
Yeah, hi, thanks. I was going to say this question for later discussion, but I'll ask it now. You mentioned, Dr. Ridland, the 10, 20, 30-year time horizons, and you have predictive modeling that can help us with that. I see a 30-year time horizon as helpful in our planning, but also in our evangelism to the community. Here's what we're up against. And we don't have a good handle on that now because a key parameter has changed, the CO2 in the atmosphere. And so, we can look at everything from El Nino to Milankovitch cycles and beyond at both ends, but we don't know what we're up against. Do you see USGS as being able to help us with that sort of, I would say, short-term in climatological terms, modeling data, or is that sort of beyond the normal scope of what you could help us with?
No, quite the opposite. That's more of the, as was mentioned earlier, what really gets our agency, what's the big push right now? The big push is exactly what you mentioned. We look at global climate models, greenhouse gas, and trying to take a look at that 30-year projection. We're actively doing a project, a couple different locations. One of them we're starting to get into is near Scott Air Force Base right now. Something very similar with the surrounding communities. We use the document NCHRP 1561. It's got several different approaches that also kind of translate, shall we say, regulatory flows or design flows, that are used for hydraulic structures, but putting them into the future. And so this is something that is a real incentive for the GS to be involved. So it's quite the opposite, and we can, in fact, be able to, provide that kind of input into some of these models to really evaluate, the current, existing conditions, and then also taking a look in the planning side of it is, where we're headed in the future in terms of urbanization or development or whatnot. Whatever we want to plug in there, that's certainly probable. So, okay. Absolutely.
So do the data you collect drive toward a better understanding of whether a 1 in 100 year rain event or flood event is going to happen every 10 years, or the rainfall amounts aren't expected to change as much as the intensity of a handful of storms. I'm looking for some hope that that your data will help us understand that.
Yeah, it may be. I mean, I think there's a group of people that would love to get in the weeds of that conversation. So I may not do it justice with you, but
No, it's just for the answer for the group. That's all.
Yeah, sure. I think, we do a lot of 30-year projections for the year 2050 right now, and there's a lot of global climate models out there that we use. So whether we're seeing different types of intensities, a lot of different approaches. To give you an example, something we've done more recently is take a look at these models, and there's probably 10 of them, to which 7 we found appropriate, and then we start analyzing these 7 different global climate models and said, are they going to be something that we feel is appropriate given the history, some of the data, and where we feel things are headed. And there's more to it than that, certainly, but that's typically how we approach these things to find the optimal models that we can use. And 1 in 10. I mean, we're looking at these 100-year efforts, or excuse me, these 100-year rainfalls or these 100-year floods. These are very temporal. They're very temporal. They change. We've seen a lot of change just even with speaking of the Merrimack River, we've seen a lot of change just with its total flow in the 100 years that 100-year events that occurred nearly back to back, of course, which is not uncommon. People need to understand what 100-year flood means. But so. Yeah, I would think that we could do something to, put something together and then maybe talk it out a little bit more, but we could provide some good models there to offer some good predictive hydrology.
Dr.
Thanks
Hammer.
a lot. I appreciate it. I hope that wasn't a tangent.
Dr. Hammer.
That wasn't a tangent, Dr. Rambo. In fact, it brought up something that I hadn't thought of until then. Dr. Riddlin, we have laser transit cross sections of the most active portions of the stream. Those data were acquired between 98 and about 2005. Would those be helpful for a long-term, say 30-year projection of how this channel might change?
Absolutely. Yeah, the more data that we have like that, it's going to be very helpful in taking a look at those rates and trying to be able to correlate those to, to the events that have occurred, right? To the fluvial induced events that have been in the past. So we have some information that we can get into to take a look at some of those, obviously the rainfall and the intensities of that rainfall correlate, but it certainly would. The model that I showed, even though I didn't get in the weeds with it, that RVR meander model in the very front slide there really takes a look at these 30-year projections out. And you can customize that model to deal with different types of specifics that you're interested in there. But, that'll have to be an in the weeds discussion for later. But the data that you have back like that, as soon as you mention that, yeah, I get excited to hear that because it's very useful.
Thank you.
Sure.
Again, no other questions. Thank you again. We appreciate it. Dan, thank you for setting this up. Appreciate it. So you're welcome to stick around, but otherwise we'll head to the priority locations and table that Joe and I guess Mrs. Clark helped put together. And Joe, you want to take it from here?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Mr. Chairs and members of the task force, it was more than just a 2-person effort. I do appreciate the assistance of Councilmember Clark, but I did ask for input from a number of people to kind of test the validity of the information that was provided. So I want to thank them. That includes Dr. Hammer, Dan Ron, Rick Brown, Travis Newberry, and others. First and foremost, when I talk about the table and the information that's contained within the columns associated with it, I want to emphasize this is just the starting point. Again, we've talked at length about priority locations, 8 of which are in the Cox Creek watershed, 1 of which is in Bottom Creek. And then we added a 10th item, which is the Stormwater Master Plan. The need to kind of understand what the priority locations mean and how to assess them in terms of where do we start was something that we kind of kept talking about and making an effort to kind of bring to fruition. But the thought is that we're getting to the point where we need to know priority locations, at least for the purposes of a future election where the parks and stormwater sales tax may be a part of the question that we're asking residents to consider. So at the last meeting, I identified just some general information and gave what I believe may be 3, now 4 reasonable priority locations, the 4th being the Stormwater Master Plan. The task force members had a lot of good questions and wanted more information, and that's what the Department of Planning and others did, is we expanded the table to include new categories, to give information in those categories relative to those locations, and then finally to leave open 2 columns which relate to timelines, solutions, and finally cost. And so tonight it's being presented to you not so much for an action, but for critique. And then again, if we are in a position, we need to start whittling down those locations to at least a few. And the reason I emphasize that is the problems are persisting. And so when we've identified something that's a problem and say it's getting worse, it is getting worse. And as we sit and talk, we're not getting closer to starting the Stormwater Master Plan process. And so I think what I'd like to do is say, we have an election that we've talked about. To be effective in that election, we need to give people an idea where that money might be spent. And that is now at the discretion of the task force. And the intent of the table is to give you information that hopefully will help you make those decisions regarding priorities, regardless if it's the 3 that were chosen by the department or 3 others chosen by the task force. But I would like to get headed in that direction. So when we do start our campaign and we start talking about what we need the money for, we have consensus where we'd like to start. Mr. Co-Chairs, that's my pitch tonight, and I'm glad to take comments on the table and respond to any questions. Thank you.
Thank you. Any questions? Dr. Remy.
Thank you. This is actually fantastic. I think you guys did a wonderful job. Only question I had for you is, so I think the 4 identified areas certainly deserve merit to be considered in priority. My only question would be number 1, temporary mitigation efforts within the main channel of Cox Creek certainly provides an opportunity to do something sooner than later for an area to help mitigate and temporize the problem. But I'm just curious to see, is there any consideration for triple meander downstream from Anniversary Park to Point Clayton area? That area to me seems like a high priority area as well. The both of them seemingly have some overlap. If you take the first priority as a general recommendation, any thought that maybe that could be also a high priority area and maybe could be rolled into number 1 as a area that could have temporary mitigation efforts at least engaged in that process?
Mr. Co-Chair, any of these can be elevated to the top, the number 1 priority or a higher priority than they may have now. The rationale that I used relative to the triple meander and the detention basin near Anniversary Park was just the simple fact that they are major episodes of erosion and stream degradation. And looking back on the Strecker Road Cutbank, a project we did a number of years ago, the design, the engineering, the reviews by different agencies took months and months and months and months of time. And from that perspective, it doesn't mean it shouldn't be done. It's just if we're looking for something to arrest the problems we have temporarily, that's why I chose the first. Now, saying all of that, Dr. Hammer has prioritized those two locations as number one. He mentioned that at the last meeting. There may be temporary steps we can take, and I would defer to him on that.
Ms. Clark?
Yes, I just want to say that I didn't have much at all to do with this. Mr. Vunich and his team really put this together and did an excellent job. And I so appreciate the time and the thought and the energy that the entire department went to get to give us this prioritization information for the 9 erosion issues that were identified by Dr. Hammer and Mr. Jones. And I'm so thrilled to see that this process is working, that we've developed a matrix that quantifies and qualifies each issue. Just thank you so much for taking this so seriously, and your vast knowledge and experience that helps us out with giving us all this information. I've worked in manufacturing for many years before I retired, and I've worked with and for people from all different countries, and not all the different countries, but many different countries. And the Japanese are extremely skilled at project planning. And in America, we borrow most of our planning from the Japanese. And their philosophy is that it costs little to plan and less to do if it's planned correctly. So I think taking the time that you've taken and that we're going to take to plan this first is very important. So when we develop this, just get my thoughts together, and considering the things that you wrote in the document that you put together about risks and cost and time and et cetera, before we start to implement these, we have to consider all of these things. And so looking over this document, I think that maybe if we took this and made one more matrix that's a derivative of this, that gives us discrete data. So we take these and we make our list of all of the criteria, your criteria, and all the criteria that each one of us have. And we give a rating to each one of the criteria. For example, if it's a safety, public safety, we could say that we give it a 3 for a life or death situation, or a 2 for a bad injury, or a 1 for a simple injury, and the 0 for no injury at all. And then we're considering a sum of sufficiently large number of independent variables or criteria. Prioritization can't be justified by what we consider to be the best or the most popular order that we just come up with what we think. Dr. Hammer has given us this list of places that we should consider. And I think we need to take all of the criteria that we've come up with and put it into a discrete matrix so that we can see in numerical value which one of these things weighs the most, has the most weight. If we don't, we're sort of taking 1 or 2 of the criteria and determining our priority list on that. We can't just, there's just too many to just grab it out of the air. So I would suggest that we make another matrix, use this matrix that we've got as a really good informational matrix and take each one of our criteria, the ones I just jotted down that I would have from listening to our group last month, and listening to Dr. Hammer's presentation he gave, would be safety, health, and environment. We've got that on this list that yes or no they are, but if we gave them weights, safety could be 1, 2, or 3, health, same, environment, urgency, cost, timing, the riparian condition, roads and trails, loss of forest cover, soil type, site slope, flood zone, current property damage, downstream effects, and coordinated project, if it's coordinated with another project or not. Those are the things that I pulled out of what we've said so far. The sum of the ratings could help us to determine where we would start with this concept phase of planning. And then we can go from there with a PDCA, a plan, do, check, act. And I think that it would just give us a beginning. Right now, I feel like we're selecting which one we want to prioritize as number one on some of opinion and some maybe what we think is the most important, but we need to give them a weight so that we can look at that and not use that as our Bible that we have to follow, but as a starting point. That's all.
Thank you. Joe, you always do a great job. I've worked with you and that for years. So you always put together a great matrix like this, no matter what subject it is. I'll let Dr. Hammer respond to you, and then we'll go Ms. Edens, Dr. Rambo, and Dr. Remy. Dr. Hammer, if you remember Joe's question.
And the question was, is there temporary steps that can be used in the Triple Meander area as well as the detention basin that's failed near Anniversary Park?
That's to you, Dr. Hammer.
I'll come back to you.
Okay. Ms. Edens.
Yes, I have just a couple of comments. And first on the overarching idea about the strategy behind why we just want to pick a few things first and get a cost.
I'm sorry. Can you talk a little bit louder, Lauren? I can't hear you.
Sure. I think it's my laptop going bad. Is this better or worse? Okay, I'm just going to have my face up here. And I think my fan kicked on, so just stop me if you can't hear me again. My laptop's overheating. So I get the reasoning of the department for only picking a couple of projects and getting a cost estimate. It's better for time, and we can't afford to get estimates for everything. Here's what I'm worried that's going to happen with the public. Do you remember when MSD asked for an increase and Wildwood said, but we don't think this is affecting us? And what assurances can you give us? So I'm just worried that we have a very large city and different watersheds, and we're going to show them, here's a cost estimate of 3 things, and expect them to understand that we are still looking at other areas and expect them to understand why they're not prioritized. So my thought is, whatever we decide that comes out of here with these 3 things, it can't be the only things that we present. The more lists that we show them with running projects for the future, the better. So I'm just worried that we're oversimplifying to the voters, and they're going to say, what about my backyard or area? And they're going to see that they're not on the list, but they're going to see one specific subdivision that is, and they're going to go, thanks, but no thanks. So I just want to caution that even if we're only presenting the voters with a few cost estimates as examples of what we would spend the money on, the entire list should be presented at the same time with the understanding that it is a fluid list and changes. We've just already seen this attitude in our area, and we've all felt it when we weren't assured that it would fix our problems. So also, can we just I know I talked about it last time, but can we talk about why we're listed as a responsible party for the backyards in the, is it Green Meadows? I just forgot the name of it.
The
Sorry,
Evergreen subdivision.
Yes. How did we decide that we were responsible financially?
Well, I don't know if, again, if it's a financial responsibility. As we talked in January, my thought is that an individual homeowner trying to convince the Metropolitan St. Louis Sewer District that their situation is an emergency and a higher priority than, let's say, one in Creve Coeur or Hazelwood or South County probably is a difficult task to assign to a homeowner. The thought was, again, that the city of Wildwood may not have at the end greater leverage, but certainly whatever leverage it has to assist in that regard. So it would not necessarily be that we pay or compensate for repair,
Okay,
but rather that we advocate.
great. I was just confused because we're the first thing under cost in that column. It says responsible parties, cost, and percent share. So that's why I was a little confused. Unless I'm reading the wrong chart, which is possible, but I don't.
No, you're reading the correct chart, and it's a great observation. And in
Okay.
an instance of like the Evergreen subdivision, the role of the city would be potentially zero.
Okay,
So
yeah,
that would be
that's what I thought. That's just why I was asking. So since it's potentially zero, can we not keep them on the list but add the triple meander that Ken mentioned? Because we're demonstrating to the public a cost which exists that we may not have to pay. So why wouldn't we go ahead and add one more project as a priority? And one more thing, and then I'll shut up. So number 4 on page 8 of 8 is the Stormwater Master Plan. I'm so sorry, I'm shouting for you guys to hear me. I'm not trying to be cross. But I need one of those megaphones from the 90s that kids have with the echo, just for entertainment. So if, again, all of these voters haven't watched the meetings, so they don't know that we've planned, that we've done the research, that we've talked exhaustively. So they might see that the Stormwater Master Plan still needs to be paid for. So because they haven't been involved in this process, they're going to say, well, if you don't have a plan yet, how can you pick these projects? So I guess my question is there any way to get that Stormwater Master Plan done and paid for before this ever gets on the ballot? Because it was listed as number 4. I just know the average person can say, well, if you don't have a plan, why'd you pick these 3? And that's a big hump to overcome.
Well, certainly I'd like to think that all 9 were done with a large degree of science, expertise, and experience. But certainly a resident that hasn't participated in the process or even viewed one of the meetings that the task force has had certainly could do exactly what you described, Ms. Edens.
Yeah.
And can we start the Stormwater Master Plan process? Well, we have $125,000 in the budget for 2021 for this task force. And that could be a decision you all make, in that we start the master plan process immediately. And solicit qualifications from different consultants, bring those qualifications to the task force, and then proceed from there.
I don't know how that what the rest of the committee feels. That's what I would do. And then you can change the language if we still don't have enough money to finish the Stormwater Master Plan.
The other question would be, do we need to put priorities to the public? I mean, if we don't have priorities, we just show, hey, these are the projects that need to be done.
Mm-hmm.
These are the potential costs, but we don't put a priority on them at that point in time. Then people can't say, well, how come they're ahead of me?
I think that's best. I know it's hard because we can't get a cost for everything, but if we can get a rough estimate, but not have to show, maybe what we do is an example of a plan. So Anniversary Park area, we own that area, so we could feel comfortable showing a plan to the public with the cost, and then just let people, understand the cost after that. Okay, thank you.
Dr. Rambo.
Right, I'll be quick. Yeah, I agree completely with both of the last two folks, members Clark and Edens. Without broader coverage that encompasses all watersheds, it's going to be hard to justify the community. And so I think to take another suggested step in that direction, it seems relatively straightforward to quantify the impact on city assets. And our original intent was to focus on protecting city assets as opposed to, folks' backyards and so forth. And that, it pains me to say it, but we don't have the money for everything. And so if we can focus in more on the actual impact to city assets, I think that will be helpful because people will understand that we need to protect this road and this bridge. And the other part is we were talking about cost for short-term repairs and cost for long-term repairs. The long-term estimates might be really hard for us to get, but the short-term stuff is moving bed load around, as Dr. Hammer suggested, and we can, make a thumbnail estimate of that in pretty short order. Okay, well, we need to apply these pieces of equipment for these many operator hours and just come up with an idea of what the short-term fix is going to cost. And then the committee has more data. We've got more arrows in our quiver in terms of, okay, well, this one's going to cost $4 million, but we can do this, this, and this, this, and this short term for 500,000 or whatever. And so it's just another, I think it's data that we might be missing, and it might be wishful thinking on my part, but I think we can do that relatively straightforward way. That's it.
I've got Dr. Remy, Ms. McCutcheon, and Ms. Holthouse, and then Mr. Cross.
I'll put Mr. Cross first, just because I usually let the city administrator answer first, if that's okay with you, Co-Chair, and then I can answer after that, if that's okay.
Okay, that's fine. Mr. Cross.
Thank you, Mr. Co-Chair. Just real briefly, I wanted to point out with regards to the Stormwater Master Plan, Mr. Vunix, Mr. Brown, and I had a discussion in my office a couple weeks ago regarding developing this plan. And with the permission of the co-chairs, I would invite Mr. Brown to speak to that. He would be the point person on developing that plan. In response to Ms. Eden's comment about, can we get that done before we, go to get this on the November ballot? I'd like Mr. Brown to speak to that, because my recollection is that is quite an involved project to develop that stormwater plan. And so I don't want to speak for him, so I will defer to him. But I think this is we need it. We don't have it, but it's a big project, and I think it would be helpful for this task force to hear from Mr. Brown in what it would take. Mr. Vunix referred to $125,000, but more importantly, the cost is just how long it would take and how comprehensive it would be to develop that. So with your permission, I think it would be helpful if Mr. Brown kind of filled everyone in about that, what it would take to develop that plan.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
Mr. Brown.
Well, that's a good question. I think what I would suggest would be maybe if there is a desire to move forward to, as Joe maybe referenced, start the process, look to engage a firm or a team in starting the master planning process, but challenge them to respond to the goal of being prepared for a ballot initiative. So enable them to put together a scope of work that would provide us the necessary information to start that planning process, Wildwood wide, all watersheds, but lead that effort towards a culmination of having enough information, perhaps to lead that effort for the ballot and the sales tax initiative. My concern was that this process citywide, given the footprint, the number of watersheds that we have, is significant. And I don't know that 125,000 frankly would cover it, but certainly it would get it started, and it would go a good ways towards that work. But until you engage a consultant and start talking about, what does it take? What can you do? What do we really want to get done? And what that'll cost, none of us really know. But the sooner we start that process, probably the better, if we're serious about something on the ballot shortly.
Thank you. Dr. Remy.
Thank you. I think these comments have been really helpful. I'll just make a couple comments in regards to some of the other comments. So I think certainly, Lauren, I think getting started on a stormwater plan is a great idea, but I don't know that we don't need to be a completion of that stormwater plan, I think, prior to putting this on the ballot. But I think certainly getting it started, I think that's a good first step. And I think that with the way Mr. Brown delineated it, I think that seems like a reasonable approach to get started when we can. I don't know that we need to do any more matrix. I think we're making this a little bit more complicated than it really needs to be. We've been on this task force for a lot longer, I think, than we expected, 2 years so far. And quite frankly, with Mr. Vunich and Mr. Brown and Mr. Ron and then Dr. Hammer and then Mr. Jones, we've got a lot of experts who have already weighed in on the prioritizations of where they think that these areas are, and seemingly they're all in the top 4 or 5 places. So I think we're just going to be spinning our wheels to try to come up with objective ways to say the same thing that we already know, that these are the high priority areas that we've already identified over the past 2 years. And quite frankly, I agree with Mr. Vunich. I think we really need to get started as soon as we can. Because I think that identifying the prioritization is also going to be helpful. In regards to the potential ballot measure for November, I think it really is going to come down to, frankly, that we're just going to have to, going to have to continue to let members of the community see all of the different areas. And that's, I think, over 80 areas that have already been identified. They need to know that. So we have to demonstrate that these are the areas that are currently affected. We do need to demonstrate the areas that are high priority for this reason. We do need to let the folks know about this is the plan to develop a stormwater plan, and we've already started those initiatives, but quite frankly, we don't have the funds nor the ability to move forward in this unless we get some further buy-in from the community. And I think the last piece of the puzzle really, to me, is when I think about, if the bridge at 109 and 100 were to somehow fall into the road, that's not part of my ward. It's not. But if somebody were to ask me, we need to spend a lot of money to get that bridge fixed, well, I know that it's going to impact me. And so we really have to just let the public know the impact if Clayton Road or a Stricker Road or another road, in fact, or a bridge has significant damage that's going to alter the way that we utilize our city infrastructure. And so some people may not have rural internet issues, some people might, but for the whole city as a whole, that's a major problem. And I think that people need to really get to the understanding that erosion and these areas, these are high priority areas for a reason, because they will impact people regardless if they live right next to these locations. And so we just have to do, I think, a good job of just explaining that. And to be honest with you, and I don't mean to put her on the spot, I have full faith that the work of thus far that Mr. Patton and Ms. Althouse have already started. Their education development so far, I think, is going to be impactful, not just for a ballot measure, but just for also additionally educating the public about really the scope of these issues. So I'm not in favor, to be honest with you, of going back and doing another matrix. I think that we should, I think I'd rather put my faith in the 5 people that have already gone through this and come up with these as the 3 or 4 areas of prioritization. And I think we should start at least developing some of the plans to address these issues as soon as we can, and then bring these into what Ms. Edens mentioned and work on getting a stormwater plan initiated, as well as following up with other prioritized areas as we get past these. And we should do it in a phased approach. So phase 1, we look at these, phase 2, phase 3, phase 4, and that'll all be part of a stormwater master plan. So that'll be important as we move forward. Thank you.
Thank you. Ms. McCutcheon.
Thank you, Ken. I think you made a lot of good points. I definitely think the stormwater master plan needs to be done. We may need to tweak it afterwards, but I really do think it needs to be done before we go to the voters. As anybody who's participated on committees know, that no matter what the issue is, the general public doesn't really know all the time and the effort that's gone into something, all the background, all the research. Can tell you that from sitting on the master plan update for the city, from the town center update. But I do think they put a lot of value in the fact that the volunteers who have come to work on different issues and different master plans have done a good job. And, you know, they stepped forward, they were volunteers. Some of us are elected officials on these committees as well. So I'm agreeing with basically with Ken is, I don't know that we need another matrix. I mean, I understand the importance, Teresa, of what you're saying, but given the overall scope of things in the picture, I don't know that we really need another matrix. And we do need to let the public know in general what it is that we've been doing, what the aim and what the goals are. And that's Ms. Holthouse and her committee's job to do that. We don't want to do a lot of details. We'll get bogged down in the details and people will start looking at that and they'll go, I really don't want to read all this. I don't really know what I want to know. What is our plan and how are we going to execute it? And I think that's what the public's generally interested in. Yes, funding is a huge issue. And I know y'all probably don't want to hear me say this because I was kind of, you know, I didn't even know about putting this on the ballot in November. And I don't know that for a fact because I think the master plan should be done first. I think we need to make sure our education piece is honed and ready to go and is informative. And we've done a lot of field work. We know what needs to be done and we know what needs to be addressed. But I'm afraid that if we don't get all our ducks in a row and get them in a row in an appropriate way, that when we go out to the voters, then they're gonna say, just like they did 2008, it may be close, but I think we have a better chance of getting turned down if we don't have a stormwater master plan of some sort before we go to the public. And I know I'm just going to put it out there and just say, because those of you know, I'm direct and that's what I do. So I know there's a lot of issues about the Ward 5 Evergreen subdivision, but everything in this city is a city asset. And we have no greater asset than we do than our residents. And we are responsible for protecting our residents. That's what a city does. And when I was looking over these projects this afternoon, and listening to comments that have been made regarding the Evergreen subdivision multiple times, I was going through it and I found out that what we're asking and what the concerns are in the Evergreen subdivision are really no different than the ones at Highlands and at Wild Horse, are any different than the Elegant Child's issues and their business. They're not a resident. I'm not saying they're not important. I'm just saying that they all have some of the same components. And yes, rear yards are being affected here, but it's the high water episodes that cause the flooding that abuts a common ground and it overflows into private property because that's what abuts to it is private property. And I know one of the other subdivisions are having some issues, but it's also common ground. So it's common ground in Evergreen as well. It's common ground in Wild Horse. There's the other subdivision, I was at the Wildwood of Meadows. They even created their own issue. You know, they covered it up, made it a common ground area to maintain it. And so now it's leaking. Now they're having issues with it. So what I'm saying here is that everybody's putting this as Evergreen issue as simply, quote unquote, a resident issue. And why would we want to pay tax dollars for that? And Ken said it well, it's not in your ward, so I'm not interested in it. And I don't think the citizens as a whole, if you put this to them as everybody's going to benefit from the long run, let's face it, this is benefiting everybody's property values. We get these Cox Creeks and Bonham Creek and all those issues dealt with. It affects everybody's values for their city as a whole and then economically as well. So there is all the same components. It just happens to be not just with Evergreen, but it's Wild Horse and it's Wildwood Meadows as well, that individuals are involved in this and more impacted because it's right there next to their property. And the last thing I'm going to say is, again, one of the most important aspects of a city is to protect their residents and to ensure them quality of life. And the fact of the matter is that here on Evergreen, we have a resident whose life is being threatened. It's not just their property, but their life is being threatened because their house is about to go into a creek bed, which has been altered by flooding. Thank you.
And again, just a reminder, this is not just a stormwater tax. It's going to be for parks also. So, so that does include the whole city and all the residents. Ms. Holthouse, Mr. Gunther, and then Dr. Remy.
First thing I would say is I'm another vote for moving the stormwater plan up high on the list. I think it addresses both erosion and flooding, gets at the root cause, and everybody sees how it affects them no matter where they live. So I think that is a place to start. And I think we could perhaps build out, you know, 1 or 2 of the watersheds of the 9 to demonstrate here's what we're talking about. And, you know, maybe that's enough to explain to the voters why we need money to finish that process and then remediate some of the damaged areas. Second point I would make in terms of presenting the whole list, I think the reality is a lot of the projects that might be important for other reasons have not made the cut just because we know we don't have the money to even probably do the engineering, much less the fix. So I think rather, you know, I like what Ms. Clark was saying about, you know, maybe quantifying some things, but I think before you even get to that, there's a whole bunch that you're just going to say they're important for all these reasons, but we need more, we need funding before we can address them. And I think there's a way to use that status for a lot of items as a way that drives why we need additional sources of funding, and you know, parks and stormwater tax is, you know, the option that we may put before them. And then the final thing is, as I understood that the number 1 priority of kind of moving some bed load around, is that something that could be done as part of a temporary fix on the triple meander? And I don't know if that's a question for Mr. Vunich or for Dr. Hammer.
I'm going to hand that off to Dr. Hammer.
Well, first, I apologize that I was having problems a little earlier when Rick was trying to ask me a question. I've got an intermittent contact tonight on the internet. There's a couple things related to the question you asked, Ms. Holthouse. The idea that we're just moving stuff around, moving bed load around in the creek to be doing something is not quite right. The question we have is whether moving bed load in key locations where there's an abundance of it and where there's so much of it that it's interfering with our ability to even plan for what to do next in the stream, because it's creating accelerated scour and erosion in key places, 3 of which are in the triple meander. So it's not so much just moving something around to be doing something. It's a low cost opportunity to at least buy some time and to determine whether there is some combination of other things we can do in terms of engineering and hydrology that would allow us to do things that haven't been done before. 2 of the things that have been done in Wildwood previously, the work we did that Mr. Vunich led with MSD on the detention basins, that took 2 or 3 years to get done. And it was a lot of meetings, a lot of effort, but it succeeded. And the living wall at Point Clayton and the Strecker Road remediation both succeeded as well. And these were things that nobody had ever attempted before in this part of the world. So I think given the severity of the issues and the fact that we are really concerned with what's happening at the triple meander, because as I mentioned in the last meeting, the water did cross one of those peninsulas. So we're at risk of having a major catastrophe in that part of the creek at some time we can't predict. We heard a good presentation tonight from a USGS researcher who talks about modeling, and the two things he said were that were really important were one, a tremendous amount of data are required before you can model a fluvial system. Even to model storm response requires about 10 years of baseline data. We were collecting copious amounts of data for about 7 years, and we weren't still at the point where where anybody would agree to do the modeling. There's some other things that we need to consider too. LIDAR has been mentioned several times as a way to get some really precise topographic and stream channel data that can be related directly to channel stability, sediment distribution, erosion and deposition, and that sort of thing. But we don't know how well that's going to work in this creek. So I guess where I'm going with this is there are some things we need to continue to do while you're discussing whether or not you want to have the master plan before you put the tax up for vote. There's public awareness that needs to be raised. We've been talking for a long time about putting together some programs to raise public awareness. We've got one, I think. So I think it's really important to start multitasking and prioritizing not only what to do in the creek and in the watersheds, but the ancillary projects we need to do to acquire the information and the procedures that are going to work in this system. We've been talking about using drones for a while to monitor the creek, and it came up again tonight from a potential collaborator that we hadn't talked about before. So I think we're wasting time, quite frankly. I hate to be so blunt, but those who've known me for 25 years will say that, yeah, this is part of the package you get. So I think we need to be concerned about the master plan. I think it's something important. I don't think it'll take as long as we think, because we know a lot about this system already and it's unique. So our stormwater master plan is going to have to be very specific to wildwood conditions and to the damage that's already done. So I think we can get a pretty good idea what should go into that master plan, whether we have it ready or not by November, but we can at least have a draft ready that says these are the issues we're facing, these are the technologies we think will work, and this is what we're trying to put together. But if we try to approach this whole problem, this whole challenge, one step at a time, the way we're going, I'll be dead and in the ground, and half you folks will too, before we get where we need to go. So I think there's a certain amount of urgency that we're not facing on this. And so I would urge us, I'll give you one more example. It's really exciting that USGS wants to work with us. There may be 3 people in this meeting tonight. That would be Mr. Archesky and me and Mr. Vunich, who will recall that when we started working on this 25 years ago, one of the first things I did was approach USGS. And what we discovered was, and it was hinted at tonight, all the USGS scientists, all the Corps of Engineers scientists, the people that are doing research for federal agencies have 2 challenges. One is to meet agency goals and criteria, but the other one is to engage with the public often enough and with enough relevance that those agencies are doing things that they can take back to Congress and say, hey, we're doing good for the country, because if they don't, their budgets get whacked. But when we first tried to approach the USGS, all the local researchers were doing things that they were already established in programs, and nobody wanted to approach Cox Creek because it was too much of a challenge. There were too many uncertainties involved. We've got a couple folks now that may be interested in helping us, and I think that's something we need to culture too immediately, because if they agreed tomorrow to start working with us, it would take them a year to get their programs ready to come into the field and do the kind of data collection and modeling that they need to do. They're not going to be able to start the week after they say yes. Let's collaborate. So I'm sorry to be so long-winded about it, but I really think that this conversation ought to be trending towards what can we do now while we're doing these long-term things that are going to be necessary to get the funding you need. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, if the USGS is anything like the Corps, there's 3-year budgets. So they've already planned 3 years out for things that are coming along. So Mr. Gunther, Dr. Remy, and Mr. Farmer.
Thank you very much. And Dr. Hammer, you said this very eloquently. A lot of things that I was thinking about here. I I'm a proponent for measure twice, cut once, and I'm also concerned about paralysis by analysis. So somewhere there's a happy medium in here. I just was thinking that we talked about if we're going to have a vote in November and we're in February, we have 8 months. And I understand people wanting to have the master plan done beforehand at the same time. And then I'm hearing, let's go out and solicit RFQs and go through that analysis, find an engineering team, come up with a master plan and do all this. And I just don't see it happening. And so I would offer this idea, and Dr. Hammer was saying as much. Is there a way that we can do some kind of an executive summary where we as a committee make our case to the public? This is important to do. We need to do this. This is a summary of where we are. We don't have all the answers right now. And that might even be a plus in terms of, again, I'm not in this. You haven't picked me number one and I'm at the last. But these are all the things we have to accomplish. These are the goals ahead of us. And write our case for why this needs funding. And it seems so obvious that we need to do this. And so I think that I would just look at, rather than saying, let's have a completed master plan, let's at least have something, I'll call it an executive summary of where we're at, that makes the case to the public of why we need their support to move forward, because we do have a lot of tasks at hand. And at the same time, we have a locomotive coming at us at Cogs Creek. And do we stand by and just watch that and analyze it and analyze it and analyze it and look at it 50 different ways? Or do we do something about it now so that we don't have further loss? And all you have to do is see that cutback next to Strecker Road and think about, if we have infrastructure, if we have roads that are in peril because this stream is doing what it wants to do and we're not doing anything about it, then that's not a good thing either. And lastly, I guess I would just say, as you've heard from Dr. Hammer, his association with our city from its inception and his knowledge of our city and the watersheds, again, I would just say, for one member of this committee, can we turn to Dr. Hammer and say, can this executive report be done by you to make this powerful case of what we are doing, where we're at right now, in lieu of an absolute final button down master plan? But because you know us, you know this intimately, and why do we reinvent the wheel with bringing in all new engineers when you not have this knowledge of us? So
maybe Mr. Brown, Mr. Rand, or even Joe, I believe, Maryland Heights and Creve Coeur, they have a stormwater management master plan. Did they put up their city for a vote before the master plan was complete? Does anybody know? Nobody seems to know. Okay.
I don't know.
I believe
that
they did not have the master plan when they were doing their education.
I do know that it wasn't on the list of things that they said they were trying to fund with the tax. So I don't know whether that means it had been done but they were focused on some specific things they were going to do with parks, some specific things they were going to do with stormwater. And then they had a very impactful map that showed all of the St. Louis metro area and who had a tax and who didn't. And at that point, there were 2 areas that were not, which was Creve Coeur and Wildwood, and then a couple of small dots somewhere else. So if we revise that map right now, it's going to look like a few little dots, and Wildwood are the only places that aren't addressing this issue with tax dollars.
Dr. Remy, yeah.
No, that's a great point. And also just that great point, Ms. Holtas, because that map is actually in the presentations tonight, actually. No, I think you're spot on. And I think Mr. Gunther's answers are spot on. Just to remind everybody in this committee, we actually voted already to put it on the ballot for November. We just have to actually send it to council. So we've already voted at this group already to put it on in November. So I just want to make sure people know that part. So I just want to bring that up because I actually think that the comment about paralysis, I think we are paralyzing ourselves. We've been working on this for almost 2 years. We are at the point now, we can move this forward. We put it on the ballot. We send it to council, let the council discuss it. and we can get it to the point where then we have an attainable goal that's where we're going to put it. And we're going to have to ramp up, as mentioned, some of the strategies to make sure that everybody knows that these are the problems across all 9 watersheds. And in these 9 watersheds, we've prioritized these areas for this moment. And these are the reasons why, but this is a major problem. And then we don't need to have a stormwater master plan before we put this up. That I don't think is a great idea. We can certainly get one started, but we don't need to certainly put this. I think that we are making this more complicated right now. And I understand the reasoning behind it, but I think we really need to move forward. And I'm in the chair position, so I'm not going to make a motion, but I think tonight we definitely need to make a motion to recommend this to council, even if it's just from our committee. We can let Parks and Planning do their own motion when they're ready as well.
Thank you. Mr. Farmer, then Mr. Cross.
Yeah, I think, much like Ken and Mr. Gunther and Dr. Hammer have said, I mean, my time on this committee has been, I think it's been 18 months, about as long as I've been a council member. My philosophy in terms of representing, whether it's on a committee or on the council, is, the easy answer is an easy answer to pick something if we have 100% of the information. We're not ever going to get 100% of the information. We don't want to wind up in a position, certainly not to disparage anybody's hard work or anything, but, we have an internet task force that has been, or an rural internet committee that's been around for 15, 20 years, it seems. And we're just finally getting to a point where maybe we could do something, and all of a sudden the technology that we've been figuring out for the last 15 years is about to get, outdated by satellites. So, the fact of the matter is, this to me is a city problem. I represent Ward 4. We all have our own little fiefdoms that we want to protect and keep safe. But, the residents in Deb's subdivision, if that guy's house goes into the creek, then the next house is going to go into the creek, and that becomes a much bigger problem. Same thing in Wild Horse. This is a city issue. We don't have 100% of the information. We're not ever going to get it, but we 100% need to start to take some action on some of these things, because every spring storm we get, all I see is more money going out the window every single day that we wait on this thing. So I'm happy to be the person to put a motion together to say, let's at least get this to the council and see what their appetite for this is, and let us kind of have our conversations with those people at that level. And if they want to push it back to us, that's the way it's going to go. But I, for one, will advocate strongly that, we cannot keep waiting for somebody else to fix this problem for us. The government, the big government's not going to step in. We're not going to have, Elon Musk isn't going to descend from Mars and give us money to fix our creeks. This is our issue to fix, and we need to fix it. So let's get this show on the road.
Thank you, Mr. Cross.
Thank you, Mr. Co-Chair. Not to be the bearer of bad news, but it actually goes along with what folks are saying. The time frame is shorter than you think. We don't have 8 months, we have 6 months. We have to have the ballot measure, the exact language that's going on the ballot by the end of August, beginning of September. We are required to have that ballot measure to the Board of Election 60 days prior to the actual election, which it would be November the 6th. So as Dr. Remy said, the council has voted to put it on there, but we have 6 months roughly to identify, and what that is for. We can continue with education afterwards, but we really, in effect, only have 6 months to get this done. So there's a sense of urgency, as you all are pointing out, and I just wanted to just kind of quantify that in terms of how many months we actually have to get this done. Thank you, sir.
Ms. Edens, and then Dr. Rambo.
Mr. Archesky, there's a motion on the floor.
I was going to second it, actually. I just wanted to clarify.
I need a second.
A motion, yep. And
Edens seconds it.
I put me back in the speaking order after we take a vote on this, because I would like to make another motion after this one rather than amend it.
Okay. Dr. Rambo, you have a comment on this?
Well, could you repeat the motion, please?
I believe the motion is to present.
Move it to the council?
Yep.
Move to, okay. Yeah, I'd rather say this now than in council. We have quantitative folks from various disciplines on this task force, and I'm missing why we don't make some effort to have a more quantitative approach to present to folks about why we made the priority decisions, because it all looks like Cox Creek to me. And if we put it on the ballot, if we get it on the ballot in 6 months, it could easily fail if we don't have support of the entire community. And so I'm hoping that we can do a better job of saying we have these threats to, city infrastructure, or whatever the criteria we decide on are. Because otherwise, if we just sort of vaguely put it out there, hey, we've got this list of 9 watersheds, people are going to have all sorts of questions, particularly if they refer back to these documents and say, well, they're just looking at Cox Creek. So
I think that all
I think it's worth considering.
come to attrition when Ms. Holthouse and her committee comes together and puts together the substance for the vote. I mean, that can
Okay. Okay. Okay.
Any comments on the motion? Any other questions?
I have a question.
Okay, Ms. Edens?
Yes, Mr. Cross, based on what you said, I interpreted this motion to be incredibly helpful, but I just want to clarify, are you saying that the final ballot language has to go along with this motion and you don't have time for the final ballot language?
No.
Ms. Edens, what I was saying is that it's our understanding and talking and looking into this, that the final ballot language itself needs to be to the Board of Elections 60 days prior to the actual.
Correct, but it doesn't have to be presented when we present this recommendation to council, correct? So we can get the ball rolling. Just wanted to double check that I didn't put the cart before the horse and I was helping move the cart and horse together. Thank you.
Mr. Vunich.
Thank you, Mr. Archeski. I just want to emphasize that the selection of the 4 priorities was not meant to circumvent the task force and its ability to prioritize. I think it's very appropriate that we identify the master plan as citywide. I think the redistribution of bed load at critical locations within any of the 9 watersheds is applicable. The bed load is substantial in Cox Creek, but I know it exists elsewhere, Fox Creek, Bonham Creek, Wild Horse Creek, etc. So 2 of the 4 priorities could be identified, in my opinion, as citywide, with the other 2 being in Cox Creek, yes. From that perspective. Also, the identification of detention basins and retention basins is a citywide matter as well. It crosses not only the suburban areas, but also rural areas where we have constructed them. So I think there's a way to make this a more citywide approach. And I think that can be done by the task force. And I think we can do multiple things. I think with the permission of the task force and then city council, we can begin the master plan process while we look at these other projects as opportunities. Thank you.
And in addition to that, part of this master plan would also be for the rural communities, like Ward 6, help them if they have a flooding problem or some type of erosion problem, what they can do as part of the education of the master plan. So, it's not just for the more urban areas. Any other questions? Otherwise, we're going to have a roll call vote. Ms. Clark.
Yes, my question is, since this topic is to priority locations and the table that we were presented with, are we going to take these and these 9 or 10 that we have, and are we going to find a way to qualitatively and quantitatively prioritize them? As that's what I understood this was for. I understood that Mr. Vunich put together this wonderful matrix and gave us his starting point with 3 top priorities, and he gave it to us and said, here's what I think. You guys come together and discuss this and come up with the priority that you want, but here's my suggestion. And so I haven't heard us come together and do this this task that I understood was this issue that we're talking about right now. We have the stormwater tax later in the agenda, but that's, and the matrix I'm talking about is a simple matrix. It's just something to give us a start with. It's not something that is going to take us forever to do. It's a simple thing to give us a starting point with all of these different criteria that we're talking about, so that we can look at it and start working on it now instead of putting things off. You know, we need to be working on it now. So I have, what are we going to prioritize these before we take it to?
Point of order, we're talking about the motion right now to just bring the tax ballot. Yeah, this is actually separate. Okay, it didn't seem like, it seemed like you were talking about the prioritizations, and they're separate.
My question is, are we going to prioritize these before we take it to, is this taking it to council now? Are we going to prioritize them before we take it to council? What is the motion?
The motion is just to take it before council. It doesn't, they're not going to have a list at this point, I don't believe. It's just presenting them with the option to either approve it to go forward or not. Am I correct, Dr. Remy?
That's correct. And to Ms. Clark's point, we can certainly refine these and talk about these in our, but they're separate. This is to bring that ballot measure to council. We've already got, I just want to make sure we understand from the perspective of council, we've already got over 80 locations identified. And we've got these 9, and we can certainly address what you're talking about in some further refinements, but we have to get this to council so we can start to vote on it, so that we can move it forward, so we can potentially get it on the ballot. And if we keep keeping it here, we won't get there.
Ms. McCutcheon.
So I'm having a little bit of trouble discerning what exactly it is we're taking to council. Can somebody explain that, please?
We made a recommendation at our meeting 2 meetings ago to put on the ballot measure. We decided at the end to put it on November of 2021, a stormwater tax, stormwater park tax. And so last meeting, we decided not to send it to council because we wanted to further discuss some of the things that we've already discussed tonight. But this is to just go to council.
To go to council, ask them to place this on the ballot? Is that correct?
Correct. And so a lot of the same things we're discussing tonight certainly probably will come back up at council anyway. So we'll have to, but at least it'll be there.
And Ms. McCutcheon,
yes,
as part of the agenda item relating to the sales tax, there is a draft letter that's been provided at the January meeting as well as tonight relative to the action of the task force about the sales tax.
Would you mind forwarding that to me?
Deb, it's number, just so it's on number 6 on the agenda. It's the document. Yeah, no problem. It's number 6 on documents.
And I partly in my head was, we didn't finish this up in Parks and Planning. We didn't get to talk about the sales tax. We had some other items on our agenda and we didn't get to this discussion. So we didn't actually come to a conclusion.
Mr. Archewski, would it be okay for me to just answer that?
Yes, go ahead.
Ms. McCutcheon, to that point, because I believe you guys will have a meeting in like 2.5 or 3 weeks, I think, probably. Could I make one suggestion? And I'm happy to amend Councilmember Farmer's motion if it would help. If I amend the motion to send to council in 30 days, which would mean not the next council meeting, but the council meeting after that, would that afford your committee then to be able to look at it? And then you could also send it to council, and then we'd be unified at least in sending it to council at that point?
We can do that.
So I'd like to just amend the motion then to just reflect that it'll go to council within at 30 days, which would be 2 council meetings, and post the next Parks and Planning meeting if acceptable to the group.
Any objection from the motion maker, Mr. Farmer, or from this?
Nope, I'm good with that.
Nope.
Ms. Eden, did you have something to follow up?
For a motion after this vote. Yep.
Okay.
But totally fine as amended. Appreciate it.
Mr. Newberry, would you take a roll call vote, please?
Yes, sir. 1 moment. Member Gunther? Yeah, he's single.
Yes.
Yes, thank you. Member Clark?
Yes.
Member Edens?
Yes.
Member Sturman?
Yes.
Member Holthouse?
Yes.
Member Farmer?
Yes.
Member McCutcheon?
Yes.
Member Patton?
Yes.
Thank you. Member Rambo?
Yes.
Co-Chair Remy?
Yes.
Co-Chair Chesky?
Yes. Motion carries. Ms. Edens?
Yes, I would like to make a motion that the department begins the process of soliciting bids and qualifications for Stormwater Master Plan contract.
Seconded by Dr. Remy. Any discussion?
Did I understand you to say you wanted to take bids on a proposal?
As I understood it, Mr. Brown said he would like to begin the process of soliciting companies and gauging qualifications, and I understood that to be asking for bids as well.
It's my understanding it's qualification based, correct?
That would be correct. Yeah, it would
Yes.
be. It would not be bids. It would be requesting qualifications.
Okay, I misspoke. So
Yeah,
qualification
no problem.
and scope of work, I suppose, as well would be helpful in the phrasing.
Any other discussion? Mr. Sturman?
Is this above and beyond? This is for engineering, right? Is this above and beyond Mr. Jones's firm? I thought we contracted him. So we're going for resources above and beyond what he's got to offer. Is that correct? I thought he was to be the man, our man, and the firm and his firm to accomplish engineering.
Mr. Sturman, Wright Water Engineering was brought on board to help assess cost estimates for the priority locations, so that information could be used in support of the sales tax measure. Mr. Jones's firm, Wright Water Engineering, could certainly submit qualifications for the work on the Stormwater Master Plan. But the intent was to use his expertise to give us an engineered estimate for the repairs of the priority locations. Thank you.
Engineered estimate, mainly estimating then, just estimating?
Yes, because obviously without engineered plans, it's hard to provide a precise cost.
Yeah.
And so the idea was, given what we have in terms of the data, the information that's been collected both by Dr. Hammer and others, knowing his expertise in fluvial environments of high intensities, he could give us probably the best cost estimate from an engineer's standpoint.
Okay, well, that's highly conceptual estimating that I guess without engineering, then these firms are going out to now for competitive fees or bids on their fees. Is that going to include firms such as Mark Meyer's firm then?
I would think so. We would cast a wide net. We already have many firms pre-qualify. We do that at the beginning of each year. We could start there, those that have stormwater expertise, but we could certainly cast a wide net.
So Mr. Jones's firm, what he's done now, which is estimating, very conceptual estimating, is that going to be about it? Or does he have plans for them down the road beyond this? I'm confused with this engineering resources.
Well, the context was Dr. Hammer is our geomorphologist, soil scientist. He identified the locations. He did not feel comfortable assigning a estimate or a cost for such a repair. What we got with Mr. Jones was he has done projects across the country, inclusive of Wildwood. His ability from his experience to basically understand the scope of the problem and what fixes have been used before, then utilize past cost estimates or cost assessments for those fixes to give us a very, I would consider, solid number. But again, if we asked Mr. Jones to basically give us cost, finite cost, then there would be a certain degree of engineering, and we just don't have the funding right now to accomplish that.
Okay, that's what I thought. Thank you.
Mr. Rand.
No, never mind. Thank you though. I'm good.
Any other discussion on the motion? Ms. McCutcheon.
So I'm guessing I'm not understanding the motion based on this discussion that just occurred. So are we asking for someone to put together a stormwater master plan for us, or are we discussing something else?
I guess the discussion is for Mr. Brown to look into potential firms that could do such a work, put together a stormwater master plan.
Got it. Thank you.
Anyone else? John, Mr. Gunter.
Yes, are we asking for this RFQ to go out without knowing whether or not the city can afford it to pay for the fees in the study?
I'll ask Mr. Brown the question.
Well, typically the way we approach it is to solicit for qualifications. And then from the list of firms that we receive those qualifications, choose the one we feel is the best fit, most qualified to meet the work that's been identified. And then you develop a scope of work and talk at that point, then you begin to talk about fee and how much it would cost to complete the scope of work. So essentially, yes, we go forward and then ultimately drill down to the cost, and we would have to negotiate a cost that we have budget for, or we have money to utilize for that work.
I believe this is just a directive for Mr. Brown to go out and look for possible firms. Okay. Anyone else? Mr. Newberry, roll call vote, please.
Member Clark. I'm sorry, Member Clark, I did. Councilmember Clark, I did.
Yes.
Thank you. Member Edens.
Yes.
Member Sturman.
Yes.
Member Holthouse.
Yes.
Member Farmer.
Yes.
Member McCutcheon.
Yes.
Member Patton.
Yes.
Member Rambo.
Yes.
Member Gunther.
Yes.
Co-Chair Remy.
Yes.
Co-Chair Chesky.
Yes. Motion carries. I believe we've already covered the stormwater, this council, unless somebody else has other comments about it. Dr. Remy?
Sorry, just I don't want to beat a dead horse. I found something really interesting. This is a really, I think, well put together document. I really appreciate the department doing this, because the one thing that I learned when looking at this document, let me just make sure was when you look, okay, so we're all looking at the document here that has the costs next to it associated with the different municipalities. And what I found most interesting about this was, just make sure I'm pulling up the right page for you guys. Here it is. It's at the bottom. Yes. When you get to page 5 and you look at the other municipalities, what I found most interesting was when you compare like our the ones that are right near us. Ellisville looks like it's 8.9875. Baldwin 8.735. Chesterfield is looks to be 8.7375. And when you compare that to Wildwood, which I believe is 8.2375, that means that even if we go for the max, which would be a half cent, we are still going to be below a lot of our neighbors in that tax, actually. So I think this is this this could be a good win, I think, for the city for to be able to find ways to try to tackle some of these problems. And I'm happy to see these numbers because it doesn't put us against be the top in the area for that number. So this was, I appreciate you guys putting this together. I think, unless I'm reading it incorrectly, but that's what at least I gauged.
Yeah, because some of the, like Berkeley, there's like 9.7%. So that's quite high. Some of the other ones are 9. Some of the very small ones. Yeah.
Mr. Archeski, Ms.
Yes, sir.
Edens, the chair of our Economic Development Committee, led a discussion last night just on this matter.
Okay, Ms. Edens.
Good. Julian put together a really quick document, a really good document. I actually had my hand up for something else before we got into stormwater sales tax. So do you want me to save that for the end of this, or?
However you want to do it, whichever
okay.
you want to.
I'll just run on for a long time talking then. Julian did put together an excellent document, and what we have found is that there's a table of rates, right? When you look at where the city is on the types of taxes and how we compare to every other city in St. Louis County. And currently we have the lowest sales tax rate. So adding this sales tax just puts us in line, basically tied again for lowest with a couple of our neighboring cities. But would not necessarily be a deterrent to our local businesses. And Julian is planning on reaching out to businesses to make sure that they understand how this tax would benefit the community and to make sure that they're comfortable with it as well. So I think the way we can understand it is by adding this. Maybe it just makes us kind of normal in the area. One of the comments that was brought up last night by a committee member is, again, if a member of the public would say, well, we don't want to be like other areas. We chose to live in Wildwood to have less taxes. Again, I think the argument is that we'd still have a tie for the lowest rate in the area, and this would just be a matter of bringing ourselves in line with best standard practices for fiscal well-being. So if there's any questions I can answer about what economic development discussed, I'd be glad to, but we saw no overwhelming evidence that this would injure the business community in any way.
And a lot of people say they moved here for the trails and the parks also, so.
They did. And there's a pretty evident map, right, of the cities and the regions that don't have this tax and how we compare. And when you look at the geography of Wildwood and what we have and the fact that we don't have a tax compared to everybody else, I think it's really quite stark. So I would love for Ms. Holthouse to use that graphic or those documents of the tax charts to educate the public with just how low we already really are, and that we can afford to go up just a little bit and still be really low in the area. And I think it helps too, that chart, right, because it lists all the taxes that we also don't have in addition, right, besides just listing the property taxes. So I think it's just an excellent tool for the public. And then again, when we reach out to these businesses with Julian, you know, a perfect example is Parkside Grill and Elegant Child. As businesses, they understand how bad erosion is, right? They're right up against it, and so they can certainly almost serve as ambassadors to the rest of the business community as well, because they can speak to it personally.
Thank you. What was your other comment you were going to make?
Yeah, I had two comments. One is what Ms. Holthouse so aptly brought up is that we do not have an independent group separate from our government body to help us advocate. My question is it ever appropriate for us to make a motion to form an independent group to advocate, or does that cross a line as a city and this all just needs to happen neighbors calling neighbors? Right, so I'm guessing I can't motion to help form a nonprofit or any independent group. Okay, just wanted to clarify that. Answers my question. And then I did have one more thing too. I know Councilmember McCutcheon brought up some concerns And I just wanted to say it's been explained before, and I've explained it, but the areas that we have are different in terms of who owns the land, who owns the creek, and where the repairs are being done. They're not being done on my common ground. I don't want to waste the committee's time, and I'm also not trying to be a hypocrite with differences. I'm just trying to make sure that we're spending our money legally. So I'd be happy to have a conversation with you on the phone, but some of the comments that you made were a little bit misleading, I think. So feel free to call me. That's all I got. Bye.
Thank you.
So can I
Ms.
respond to
McCutcheon.
that?
Yeah, Ms. McCutcheon.
Yeah, Lauren, the verbiage I used, I took right off the documents for this evening's meeting, but I'd be happy to talk to you.
Yeah, please do.
Anyone else on this topic? Otherwise, we'll move on to the update of stormwater impact fees and stream stewardship trust fund. Is that Mr. Rand or is that Mr. Vunich?
Mr. Co-Chair, it's about 8:40.
Yes,
I would
sir.
suggest maybe we postpone that item and maybe the subcommittee reports as well. We've accomplished a lot tonight. Maybe we should end on a high note.
Okay, that's fine with me, as long as it's fine with everyone else. So can I, again, thank you for everybody attending. I don't know if Dr. Hammer's still around, if he has any final comments. But I'm looking for a motion to adjourn. Motion by Mr. Farmer, second by anyone? By Dr. Remy. All in favor, say aye.
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 Bye.
Any opposed? Thank you very much. And you have a good rest of the week. Dr. Remy, you have something?